Tariffs have returned to the forefront of economic debate since Donald Trump won the US election and began using them both as a negotiating threat and a tool to fix a long list of identified economic problems. His policy of economic nationalism is nostalgically inspired by the 19th century, when tariffs were the defining trade policy of the United States, a policy that supposedly helped to keep income tax at zero and protected thriving industries. So if it worked for the USA once, could it happen again? It's an idea at the very least worth exploring, since it's promising the possibility that tariffs can create the fiscal wiggle room needed to lower taxes while surviving the old industrial heartland of the world's largest economy. Even the most pro-global economists will admit that there's certainly reasons to impose tariffs that make economic sense. That's why large growing economies like India, Brazil, and yes, of course, even China still use them fairly heavily. But the world has changed dramatically since the US last used tariffs with the breadth and depth of the level being proposed today. Nowadays, American consumers are accustomed to cheap goods made through complex global supply chains that depend on low trade barriers. New tariffs would introduce barriers, potentially forcing importing businesses to increase their prices just to stay profitable. This would effectively mean that tariffs are just a sneaky way to tax consumers. Even so, the industrial, employment, and strategic benefits of tariffs could still be worth a potential reduction in consumer purchasing power. Now, of course, recent debate on this issue has been highly politicised, but at the end of the day, tariffs are simply an economic tool. Like a spanner, they aren't inherently good or bad. Need to tighten a loosened bolt? The spanner is very useful. But if you need to perform brain surgery, maybe consider using something else. The point is, generalised blanket statements that have been made about tariffs are oversimplified because they cause different trade-offs in different markets, which should be weighed up to get a sense of the net benefit or the net cost. This means nuance is key now more than ever. So, as always, we have some questions to answer. How do tariffs work? What can we learn about tariffs from chickens and washing machines? And finally, why might tariffs still be worth it, even if they come at an economic cost? As someone who writes a lot, whether it's scripting videos for Economics Explained or drafting important emails, clear and effective communication is critical to my work. But writing isn't always easy, especially when you're staring at a blank page or trying to reword something for the 10th time. So, for this video, we're partnering up with Grammarly, a tool that I've actually been using for ages. It just helps me make my writing better and it saves time. One of the best parts is how seamlessly Grammarly integrates into my workflow. It works where you work, whether it's Google Docs, Gmail, Slack, or even LinkedIn. You can even upgrade to Grammarly Pro, which unlocks even more powerful features. For example, I can set a specific tone, telling Grammarly to be more casual, confident, and direct, and it adjusts my text to match. Plus, they have this cool feature where it anticipates readers' questions or concerns, helping me fill gaps up front, whether it's providing just enough context or offering solutions to a problem. That means less back and forth emails and editing for me. There's a link in the description so you can check it out for yourself. Clicking that link helps to support this channel, so sign up and upgrade to Grammarly Pro to level up your productivity. A tariff is a targeted tax on imported goods paid directly by the domestic business that's importing it. It's a type of government intervention that falls under the umbrella term of protectionism or even economic nationalism. The basic idea is that a tariff on imports makes them more expensive. As a result of this, domestic production becomes relatively cheaper, so the market replaces imported goods for domestically produced goods, which fosters investment, employment, and industrial growth in the domestic economy, whilst the government earns itself an additional source of income. This is a process known as import substitution industrialisation. Numerous countries throughout history have used tariffs as a means to protect and develop their industrial base. But there are a few countries whose development story is so fundamentally linked to the use of tariffs as the United States of America, making its contemporary image as the quartermaster of global free trade somewhat ironic. Tariffs were there from the very beginning, with the second ever piece of legislation passed after the US Constitution was ratified being about a tariff way back in 1789. The Alexander Hamilton of Broadway fame respected Adam Smith's newly published foundational economic ideas about the power of the invisible hand of free market trade, but he rejected it as a general rule for developing industry and building national wealth. Hamilton knew that as the United States built its institutions and earned political independence, the country would not gain economic independence from Britain until it developed a manufacturing base that could produce its own goods as efficiently and competitively. Europe had already begun its industrial revolution and was producing key goods like steel, textiles, chemicals, precision instruments, and machinery relatively cheaply and en masse. US industry was behind the curve with less infrastructure, capital, and skilled labour. It couldn't compete with the European producers in the free market, even with the significant technological barriers to international trade at the time. And so tariffs were introduced to raise the price of European imports, encouraging entrepreneurs to set up shop on US soil instead, fostering domestic industrialisation. The passing of the Stronger Tariffs Act continued into the late 19th century, with the average tariff rate on targeted goods eventually sitting above 40%. And it worked. US industries erupted. Tariffs made up 90% of federal income, and the US government was so accustomed to getting its revenue from tariffs that income tax didn't even exist up until 1910. However, the use of tariffs was hotly disputed at the time, just like it is now. While industrialisation was concentrated in the north, the higher tariffs indirectly harmed the agrarian south, which suffered from retaliatory European tariffs on their exports and slave-produced goods like cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. The south relied on these exports as a key source of income. The Morrill tariff was an additional grievance for the southern states, who were already breaking away from the Union over the election of Lincoln and his intent to end slavery. So debate around tariffs in the US is nothing new. But fast forward to the end of the Second World War and the US flips the script. The war was over, its industries had matured, and it was ready to begin competing as the leader of free trade. Technological advancements in communication and transport made trade much more efficient, and countries began to specialise to benefit from the principles of comparative advantage and absolute advantage. It also didn't hurt that every single potential global competitor at the time had been bombed into rubble. Free trade was certified as the dominating economic order when the World Trade Organization opened in 1995, which organised the decades-long trend of lower tariffs. And with this, supply chains continue to develop in their complexity, to the point where it becomes common for an end-of-chain product to have parts from 10 or more different manufacturers, all from different places in the world. All this time, free trade dominated trade policy across the world, but this began to be seriously questioned when the largest advocate of free trade imposed landmark tariffs on its largest trade partner in 2018. And because of this, we actually have pretty strong recent evidence of what the impacts of tariffs will actually be. So, what can we learn from US tariffs during this period? Well, to do that, we have to look at everyone's favourite semi-durable consumer appliance, the washing machine. A research paper by economists at the US Federal Reserve provide a fairly comprehensive account of the impact that the 2018 tariff had on washing machines. It found that the businesses who were importing washing machines passed the cost of the tariff on to consumers through price rises, which also created space for domestic producers to follow suit and increase their prices, despite not even paying the tariff. It gets worse, because the price of dryers also saw significant price increases, a product which was not directly subject to a tariff, but became collateral damage since the two goods are often sold together. Shockingly, when taking into account the price increase of domestic washing machines as well as dryers, the tariff elasticity of consumer prices was above 1. In layman's terms, this means that the additional price burden faced by consumers was larger than the tariff itself, at least in the year or two that followed. The complete pass-through of the 2018 tariffs onto consumers was also evidenced in reports from the American Economic Association and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. In effect, this meant that tariffs were just a sneakier, more convoluted way to tax consumers without having to actually call it a tax. In total, the 2018 to 2019 tariffs imposed around $80 billion worth of indirect taxes on Americans, which amounted to one of the largest tax increases in decades. Now, this part was already pretty well known, but tariffs could still be worth it if the additional employment created by protecting domestic industries outweigh the price increases for consumers. In the case of the washing machine specifically, the additional cost of the tariff for consumers amounted to $1.5 billion annually, whilst it only brought in an additional $82 million worth of government revenue annually. 1,800 new jobs were created in the US, meaning each job came at a cost to consumers of a whopping $815,000 a year. This is clearly an inefficient way to create jobs. It would be way more efficient to simply fund 1,800 new jobs by introducing a value-added tax of a much smaller amount. The evidence also suggests that tariffs can damage industry just as well as it can protect it, because it's not just consumers who buy imported goods, it's businesses too. The washing machine is an end product, so it's not the best example of a business input, but you know what is? Steel. A 25% tariff was whacked onto steel imports in 2018, and suddenly the plates, sheets, strips, beams, bars, rods, pipes, billets, blooms, and slabs that countless American industries needed as an input material became more expensive. This reduced, and in some cases eliminated, profit margins in key domestic industries like automotives, construction and machinery, triggering layoffs. So despite the tariff increasing employment in the domestic steel and iron industry, the tariffs caused a net reduction in manufacturing employment, meaning for each new hire in US steel, there were multiple layoffs in other industries. The net negative effect shows that there's just way more industries in the US which use steel as an input of production than industries where steel is the output of production. So in this particular case, tariffs didn't protect from industrial decline, it accelerated it, at least in the immediate years that followed. The decline in industry also reflects the damaging consequences of retaliatory tariffs imposed by other countries, the inevitable counter-strike in any trade war. In light of the 2018 tariffs, China imposed a series of their own on the USA, largely targeting agricultural food products. This made American agricultural exports more expensive for Chinese companies, reducing the demand for these products, resulting in less revenue to provide income in the agricultural sector. The The US government prevented mass layoffs by directly paying farmers and purchasing agricultural products, but this came at a hefty price. $61 billion was spent on supporting US farmers who were impacted by Chinese tariffs from 2018 to 2020, which almost entirely cancelled out the additional $66 billion the US government collected on tariffs imposed on China. So, tariffs certainly generate additional revenue, but through retaliation, they create the need for more fiscal spending elsewhere, so it's like an expensive game of whack-a-mole. And as a result, tariffs are unlikely to create the dramatic fiscal surplus the US needs to reach the wholly promised land of lower income taxes. Now, it's important to note that these studies were only done a year or two after tariffs came into effect, which means we can only use them reliably to understand the short run, which is clearly bad for consumers and a lot of industries. But in the long run, factors of production are by definition more flexible, so it's entirely possible that the tariffs could bring more benefits than costs, as factors of production are reallocated towards domestic production, generating investment, employment, and growth. Now, fortunately, there are older tariffs where the effects have marinated for decades. A 25% tariff was placed on light trucks imported to the US in 1964. Since then, pickup trucks and SUVs have become the highest profit margin vehicles for US car makers, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, serving as a lifeline for the US automotive industry, where offshoring and outsourcing was driving industrial decline. It also paved the way for foreign competitors to invest billions on US soil from the 1980s to the 2000s, with Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW building assembly plants in the American South to employ tens of thousands. Tariffs did exactly what it says on the tin, protecting domestic industry and encouraging long-run investment. But there was also downsides. With essentially only 3 companies supplying the US light truck and SUV market, there was much less competition, which reduced pressure to innovate and increase efficiency. And here lies the key point. For tariffs to work, the government must ensure that the protected domestic industry is competitive enough to prevent complacency and the abuse of market power so that consumers get a fair deal. If the government is going to block foreign competition, they need to ensure that there is adequate domestic competition. Ultimately, the tariff has meant that even to this day, the US truck and SUV market is not as fiercely competitive as it could be, and this has hurt consumers through higher prices and lower quality. But even if a tariff is appropriately targeted and the market remains competitive, its positive effect will still be susceptible to sneaky workarounds. When Mercedes-Benz opened their factory in South Carolina in 2006, it was clear that the SUV tariff had yet again strong-armed a foreign producer into investing on US soil. But it soon became clear that actually Mercedes-Benz was manufacturing its vans in Germany, disassembling the parts into the automotive equivalent of IKEA flatpack, then shipping it to America to be reassembled, dodging the 25% tariff on a technicality. This is clearly an inefficiency created by the tariff barrier. In fairness, Mercedes have developed the capabilities of the plant gradually over time, now assembling the engines and body parts too, but it's an interesting example of the lengths that producers will go to avoid tariffs. Other workarounds can be worse, especially when tariffs are targeted on particular countries. For example, when the US tariffs landed on China in 2018, many companies did move their manufacturing operations, but not to the US, just to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico where tariffs did not apply. It's also possible to avoid tariffs by shipping the product to a middleman country to relabel and repackage before bringing it into the domestic market. Point is, there's a lot of options for companies to avoid tariffs before they choose the often more costly option of relocating their manufacturing to the domestic economy. So there's many moving parts and trade-offs that are sensitive to the tariff specifications, markets targeted, and countries affected. Blanket statements about tariffs from all sides of what's become a politically charged debate ignore this nuance. And herein lies the problem. Trump has talked a lot about tariffs, but he hasn't been precise on the tariffs he wants to impose, which makes it very difficult to assess the economic impact. If he wants to impose universal tariffs on all goods coming into the US, then it seems like any industrial and fiscal benefits of tariffs would be more than cancelled out by the damaging combination of higher input costs, inflated consumer prices, and retaliation. This net negative effect could possibly be long run and certainly short run. So why would tariffs not benefit the US economy now when they worked wonders in the 19th century? Well, back then, global transport and communication was slow, products were relatively simple, and domestic labour was cheap. Now global transport and communication are quick, products are more complex, and domestic labour is expensive. The era of free trade has meant that complex products are produced through international supply chains where individual manufacturers have become highly specialised and often made use of heavily subsidised industries with extremely loose labour regulations in developing economies. This makes production efficient and prices low. The cat's out of the bag, so to speak. It's become prohibitively expensive for many industries to ever return to the US en masse. They'd rather dodge the tariff by moving operations to another country, or take the hit and pass it on to US consumers, which would just redistribute money from consumers to the government without necessarily bringing jobs back to the US, which is the whole point. Tariffs are still a useful tool to have in a modern economy, but they should be used precisely instead of bluntly at a universal level, where tariffs will be placed on things that never were and never can be made in the domestic economy. and to prevent maximum short-term economic shock, tariffs need to be carefully planned and gradually introduced like Hamilton did, so that the market can prepare and adjust, instead of threatening huge tariff which erodes trust and keeps industry leaders uncertain on their next best move. But even so, even after all of this, it could be argued that there are some markets where they're necessary despite the economic costs. As the globalized world becomes increasingly tense and less stable, countries are less comfortable with relying on politically misaligned countries for their products. Reliance is a vulnerability that can be exploited, especially in strategically important sectors such as semiconductors, energy, vehicles, rare earth minerals, and food. If an event broke out that dramatically escalated tensions or even triggered a war, one of the immediate moves would be to embargo trade with an enemy, which, if not prepared for, could leave an overexposed economy unable to produce the goods needed to sustain livelihoods and defence. We're talking national security, and at this point the debate around tariffs becomes more of a geopolitical concern than an economic one, and for these reasons we've created a part 2 for this video on our sister channel, Context Matters, which explains why global powers are shifting towards protectionism after decades of free trade, and how this links with rising nationalism and the risk of conflict. You should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.